Hi, my name's Robert, and I'm going through some of the passages in the Bible discussing what the authors intended to say. And today I want to read from the beginning of Genesis 1, just the first couple of verses. I'm reading from the NRSV as always. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. There are two issues here. The first is the translation, and the second, which is much harder to deal with, is the assumptions we bring to a text. The author wrote in Hebrew, Bereshith bara Elohim. Bereshith means in the beginning of. It's a temporal clause used to describe something which takes place over a period, which of course fits the story in Genesis 1 rather. We've got this elaborate account of creation taking place over 6 days, or in 6 acts if you rather. A great contrast with Genesis 2, where it all takes place in a great rush in 1 day. And in Genesis 1, the author begins by describing the situation at the beginning of creation. The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Creation out of nothing is an idea which our culture has taken for granted now for many, many centuries. But it's not heard of before the end of the 2nd century AD, after the New Testament had been written, centuries after Genesis had been put together. Creation out of nothing isn't anywhere in the Bible. It can't be, because nobody had thought of it at that point. What the author is describing is a version of the broad Middle Eastern creation story, which everybody would have been familiar with at that time. It's not creation out of nothing, it's creation out of something. They believed in a pre-creation chaos, a watery chaos, and creation was made out of this. The difference between this and the other stories is that in the other stories it's inhabited by a primal deity, a monster, if you like. In Genesis 1, the monsters don't appear until verse 21, where they're described as having been created by God, just another of the things he's made. In the other versions, creation begins with a great battle between the gods and the monster. The Babylonians had an elaborate version of this, the Enuma Elish, which describes how the monster Tiamat gave birth to the great gods, and a god called Marduk led them and their armies, and they went up against Tiamat and killed her and chopped her up and made the earth and the sky out of her corpse. Genesis 1 may, to a point, be written as a response to this story. But if so, its authors came up with something which doesn't look remotely like the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is, as much as anything, an account of how Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, became the great God, the top guy in the pantheon. In Genesis 1, God begins as the top guy. But this isn't to say, of course, that the chaos battle isn't there in the Bible, because it very definitely is. We've got these two long creation accounts side by side at the beginning, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and then we've got multiple brief mentions elsewhere in the Bible, and we need to have a look at those. So let's have a look at Psalm 74. Beginning at verse 12. It's an account of the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians when they sacked Jerusalem, and the author is begging God to come and do something about it. Verse 12. Yet God my King is from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave them as food for the creatures of the wilderness. So here you have a fight between God and a monster called Leviathan. And God breaks his heads, that's heads plural, a multi-headed monster, and gives them as food for the creatures. And we find it again in Isaiah at the beginning of chapter 27. Verse 1. On that day the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he'll kill the dragon that's in the sea. Again we have the serpent, the dragon, a twisting serpent. It's a very dramatic image, and God punishing him with his sword, which obviously involved killing him. And this isn't unique. We have a very similar account of Baal, the God's great rival deity in Kings, of course, killing a monster who looks rather similar. It's a story from Ugarit on the coast of what's now Syria, one of a series of Canaanite poems they found there. What enemy rises up against Baal? What adversary against him who mounteth the clouds? Have I not slain sea, beloved of El? Have I not annihilated River, the great god? Have I not muzzled the dragon, holding her in a muzzle? I have slain the crooked serpent, the foul-fanged with 7 heads. I have slain the beloved of the earth deities. The crooked serpent, the twisting serpent. The language is even more similar than appears from this rather old translation. In the Canaanite story, the monster is called Lotan. Of course, when these texts were written, vowels hadn't been invented. The difference between Lotan in Canaanite and Leviathan in Hebrew, which is a very, very similar language, it looks like a development from Canaanite with a couple of extra letters. The difference is 1 letter, which is one of the new letters which are present in Canaanite from half a millennium before the Isaiah text was probably written. It's part of a broad tradition from across the ancient Near East. Not only have we got to battle with our assumptions about creation out of nothing, we also have to battle with a tradition derived obviously from the stories of in the Old Testament of Israel being some sort of separate, special nation which really isn't like the others, except they keep backsliding and worshipping the other nations' gods, No, it wasn't like that. That's ancient Israelite propaganda, if you like. The truth is, they were just like any other people. And if you go back to the period before the exile, where these Leviathan texts originate, you've only got to read through Kings to see that the Israelites, in fact, much to the annoyance of the authors of Kings, of course, worshipped as many gods as anybody else. They really weren't any different. And the traditions they passed down and incorporated in these texts really aren't so very different. They worshipped a different god, but then every people had its own god. And the stories of Yahweh, of God, sometimes look rather like the Canaanite stories about Baal, which might perhaps explain some of the rivalry between the two cults which emerges in Kings. But this isn't the end of the texts about Leviathan. We've got more from after the exile. Let's have a look at Psalm 104. This is a psalm which presents a picture of creation which is very similar in many ways to what we get in Genesis 1. Beginning at verse 24, O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you've made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Yonder is the sea, great and wide. Creeping things innumerable are there, living things both small and great. There go the ships, and Leviathan that you've formed to sport in it. So, here we have the named monster, Leviathan, presumably one of the monsters God said to have been created in Genesis 1:21. And here he's been made to sport, to play in the waters. And then, of course, we've got a long description in Job 41. The author of Job loves long accounts of things. It goes on and on and on. And what he's describing has now been transmogrified from a many-headed dragon or serpent into a sort of glorified version of a crocodile. I think perhaps you find an echo of Leviathan in Jonah. There's a great storm, there's a great fish, monsters shrunk into a fish, but the elements of the story, the storm, it's the stormy waters, the thing in the sea, are still there. But this time, the fish is a more dedicated, obedient servant of God than his wretched prophet. Jonah's running away, and the fish obligingly swallows him and then gobs him up right where God wants him to go. And then, of course, we find another multi-headed monster in Revelation. The dragon and the beast are very obviously taking off this story of Leviathan. And of course, later on in the post-biblical period, we have all these nasty things out of the Bible. A snake out of Genesis 2, Leviathan, whatever they could find, all being piled together in this image of the devil, Satan himself, something which really isn't there in the texts of the Bible. You could claim perhaps it's beginning to take shape, but no. What we have are traditional images of the devil and hell, are medieval, not biblical. But I'd better stop there before I ramble off even more, and next time I'll continue with Genesis 1. Bye.